I'd like to ask you, Dr. Eli Karlin, what is the biggest risk?
It's a great question. I think we live our lives based on risk assessment, whether we like it or not. We all do it. In this area, I think I'll break it down into two fundamental risks as it relates to the healthcare real estate sector, right? Healthcare and real estate. First is sectorial risk, right? Healthcare. Um, in that segment, I think there's three main categories that I would focus on and that keep us up at night. One is the regulatory. So all the regulatory changes, they happen very quickly and sometimes unbeknownst to just members of the public. And so we spend quite a bit of time focusing on regulatory changes within the healthcare sector, understanding what the government is doing as they're the largest payer in the US, and most insurances follow what the government's sort of process looks like. So that's one. In terms of financial risk, it leads into regulation as well. The reimbursement cuts, I think that's been quite challenging for our sector. Those reimbursement cuts in different sectors, such as long-term acute care. Long-term acute care throughout COVID was a darling of the healthcare industry. They had ventilators. They were able to bring in those patients, and yet Congress cuts those reimbursements, and the type of patient that visits has nowhere else to go. So, and financial risk is certainly one of those under the healthcare sector, and then lastly, change in delivery of care. We are in an environment where technology is moving very quickly. We chatted briefly on the primary care provider losing some of their practice in either through private equity or through technology and so forth, and reshifting of the healthcare environment. So I think the change in how care is delivered in this country certainly falls in that category. So those three under the sectoral components are where we focus and try to look ahead and see how do we mitigate those risks or transfer that risk and so forth. And then in terms of real estate, and certainly as it relates to healthcare, number one, obviously tenant credit worthiness, right? Making sure that whomever we have, and you asked a question earlier about leasing. We typically in our acquisition strategies, 90% leased or above, right? Our portfolio today is about 98% occupied. So we try to mitigate that risk prior to an acquisition, whether we bring in a provider or what have you, through diligence or even prior to that. But certainly the credit worthiness is quite important in understanding how they're getting reimbursed, what is their longevity, how do they work in the long term, and that they don't falter. Like we've seen many healthcare systems that, Stewart's a great example, right? You had a lot of great outcome, you could say, in the past, and today, well, they're no longer really around, right? And a lot of bankruptcy. So that's a big one for us in terms of the real estate specific angle. And then, of course, the fragility of the business model for healthcare, right? It sort of backs into the financials. Again, it gets into things are changing. We're seeing that happen very quickly. Procedures are changing, as we discussed earlier. The pharma component. I mean, look at bariatric care. Bariatric care is slowly dying, right? I mean, with Ozempic and all the other pharma components, bariatric care is an industry that is in decline, and so we need to be conscious of that fragility of the business model. It's not as recession resilient as everybody would have imagined. It may be in some sectors, but healthcare may be better than others. But there is risk there, and then of course the obsolescence of assets. That is, from a real estate standpoint, probably the biggest one we look at is we're buying a building today. Will it stand the test of time in 3, 5, 10, 15 years? Will this asset be obsolescent? And as we discussed earlier, you bought 10 years ago a 30,000 square foot orthopedic asset that today is probably closer to 8 to 10,000 feet with the same utilization. And so, going forward, will a tenant renew? Why would they renew? Why not go somewhere else? So that's the third. And so those combined, I would say, are the big risk items that we look for. I realize not so pretty tied up in one one word in a bow, but from our perspective, those are the main focuses and the risks that we try to mitigate or like you said, transfer.